to the Episcopalian, thoughtful conversations about theology, church history, and the life of the church today within the Anglican Communion. I'm Ann Jambor, and in this podcast, we explore the beauty, truth, and depth of the Anglican tradition, its liturgy, theology, and wisdom for following Christ in the modern world. Some episodes will be conversations, others will be reflections or homilies, but all of them are rooted in a love for the historic, Orthodox, and Catholic faith as it has been expressed in Anglicanism. Today, I'm joined by my friend, Dr. Ryan Partovi, as we begin a conversation about Anglican identity, church authority, and the future of the Episcopal Church. Good morning. How are you today, Ryan?
Good morning, Ann. How are you? I'm doing well.
I'm
doing
good.
well.
You and I have had so many fascinating conversations about theology and church history, and we finally decided to record some of our conversations on podcasts. And we hit on that a little bit in our first episode that's available on YouTube. But before we jump into some of those big ideas, I'd love to start with a simple question. So how did you first become interested in Anglican theology and church history?
Oh, well, I was a history major in college. And I, I grew up in the Episcopal Church from my mom. My mom is, I think, third generation Episcopalian, so I'm a fourth generation. Um, and we would go to church only a few times a year. So to me, it was kind of a special occasion and it was a special event. And I remember being in like second and third and fourth grade as I was learning how to read, like kind of looking at the Book of Common Prayer, trying to follow along with the order of the Mass and also to learn more about what was in the back and, the catechism and that kind of stuff. And what are these creeds? Why do we have three different ones? Just like very curious. I was always curious as a child. So, and then I think in history, learning about European history, learning about sort of the version we learn in history, which is this very sort of caricaturized version of like, oh, Henry VIII wanted a divorce.
Yeah.
and basically decided to start his own church because the Pope wouldn't give him one, which is, now I know kind of a ludicrous framing, but I would say that, I learned that. And then I also, when I went to college, I had not been confirmed yet. So I was baptized when I was 9, which is kind of rare. Most people that are baptized in our church are either baptized as infants or as adults. But I was in kind of an interesting situation where my parents, for whatever reason, chose to baptize me when all of the siblings had been born. So all three of us were baptized on the same day. So my sister was a baby, my brother was probably 4 or 5, and I was 9. My brother must have been 5. So I remember my baptism, which is, again, not super typical for a child to remember their baptism. But it was something that was very meaningful to me at the time. And I also had my first communion officially that same day. And then I went off to college. And when I was at college at Emory, I met a guy who'd also grown up in the Episcopal Church, also had never been confirmed. And the main reason why I hadn't gotten confirmed is because we moved from the Diocese of Texas to the Diocese of Fort Worth. And my mom was not super keen on the Diocese of Fort Worth because we had actually gone to basically, and I know we said we weren't going to talk about locations, but who knows where we are now is all I will say. At the time, we were at the Diocese of Fort Worth, and the Diocese of Fort Worth was not ordaining women. And so because of that, we didn't attend Episcopal Church for a little while. And then I ended up going off to college. And then at college, I met this gentleman who had also not been confirmed. And we said, we really should do that. And we were going to do it together. But then I ended up transferring colleges. So I came home. And at the time, I said, Mom, I really would like to get confirmed. And I had taken a class on Christianity from the Reformation to the present. I'd taken a class on medieval heresies. Inside of my history degree, right? I had taken a class on uh, veiling in the Muslim world and Islam, and so I had taken 3 classes on Chinese history, thought, and culture. So I had explored Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, both versions of Islam, pretty much every form of Christianity you could imagine at this point, for anywhere from, Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism all the way to like, holiness and Pentecostal churches. So at this point, I kind of felt like, all right, no, I really do want to be Episcopalian, right? This is my thing. Because I'd been taking classes in college about all these different other religions and topics and areas of the world and learning about the history and understanding and really kind of it led me to really actually want to be confirmed because I was like, no, this is really what I believe. I think this is the closest approximation. Not like I am 100% orthodox on every topic, right? I mean, as your dad once said, I'm a heretic in some ways. I'm like, yeah, I identify with that topic. I'm a heretic in some ways too. And a heretic, for those who don't know, the way I'm using that term is in the very literal definition of the word, which is somebody who has it's a view that is outside of the majority, right? So the majority view is the Orthodox view. This is a more modern way to frame this, but it's like if the Orthodox view is what the majority holds and the heretical view is what the minority holds. So I'm in the minority certainly on some topics, and at the same time, the beautiful thing about the Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church in particular in the United States as the expression of the Anglican Communion is that we get to kind of use our reason along with scripture and tradition to work things out and be in the minority. And because it's a big tent and everyone is welcome, then it's sort of on issues that are not necessary for salvation, you can sort of agree to disagree. And that's why I chose it ultimately and chose to get confirmed as an adult, and ended up finding a local parish at the time. And we tried 3 or 4 of them. And the one that really we walked in and we were like, this is it. This is the place. And the priest at the time there, uh, he passed away recently, Father Christopher Cantrell. And he and I had many a hearty debate because, of course, he was opposed to women's ordination and I was in favor of it. Having grown up in the Diocese of Texas and feeling like that was just a normal thing, and having a mother who was a big advocate for it. And I remember his big argument was that because women required because basically humans required sperm, and sperm were the deciding factor in whether men were men and women were women. And so because men had the ability to reproduce and have an X chromosome or a Y chromosome and contribute those, because we encapsulate both genders as men, then therefore both sexes rather, then we're the only ones who can be priests, whereas women who only have X chromosomes cannot be priests because they only have X chromosomes. So that was his big argument, which I think might have been persuasive if what I believed was we have in common with Jesus was our the XY chromosomes, but to me it's simply the condition of being human, the humanity. And my comment to him, and I think also to anyone, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, who believe that the person who is offering the Mass is offering it on behalf of the church, the bride of Christ. Why could a woman priest not represent the bride in that sacrifice? Why could a priest not represent, Mary, the Mother of God, the holiest woman ever to exist, right? Why could a priest not represent Mary Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles, right? I mean, it's just if you're going to have that sort of representational element to it, of a representative of the bride, why could that not be a woman? It just doesn't make sense to me. So anyway, I'm sure we could have many more conversations on women's ordination, but I think that that was a big factor for me. And I think ultimately, um, Anglican theology to me is part of the journey of figuring out which church makes the most sense, taking the totality of the evidence. And I'm always, my inclination is always to try to get at the truth in any arena of life. Like that's, I actually had this realization this morning as I was driving my son home from school. I'm like, really what my life is for is like discerning the what is the truth and actually sharing that with other people, which is part of the reason why we have this podcast, right? So hopefully that brings it back to your initial question, because I believe that ultimately the Anglican view of Christianity, lens of Christianity, is the most true and or the closest to the truth. It's hard to know exactly when we're right over the target, but you sort of, as the saying goes, you get a lot of flack when you're over the target. But I think that there's there's a lot of sense for me very clearly that that's it has the best encapsulation. It takes the best of Orthodox Catholic belief, the best aspects of the Reformation and historical Protestantism, and basically puts it all under a huge umbrella that enables all to be welcome and find a place. And I don't think you're really going to find that anywhere else. It's a very unique combination of things. So I'm sure we'll talk more about it, over the months and years to come. But go ahead.
Absolutely.
Did that answer your
Well,
question?
yeah, I mean, well, how did you get interested in the theology and all of that? I mean, that's such a rich background that you have, and so personal. Um, we're using the term Anglican, and we described that really in depth in our last podcast. So we are Episcopalians in the Anglican Communion, and so we're not like members of ACNA, the Anglican Church in North America, or anything like that. We are in the Anglican Communion, and that Anglicanism is a branch of Christianity. So I don't want to get too in the weeds with all of that, but just wanted to point people to the last podcast if they have questions about why we're saying Anglican so much. Um, well, one of the things that I appreciate about Anglicanism is the way it holds together beauty, theology, history, and pastoral life in a very unique way. And you encapsulated a lot of that in what you just described. You wrote a really thoughtful vision and mission statement for the podcast. Do you want to walk us through what you're trying to capture there? Um,
Sure. Why don't you tell me what part of it, or
yeah,
maybe you read through it. Start with the vision, maybe, and then.
absolutely. So the vision statement to draw people to Jesus Christ through the beauty, truth, and depth of traditional Anglican worship. So why begin with beauty?
Oh, well, I think that that's one of the areas that we really shine. I think that, one of the things that's interesting because um, my wife Maddie and I have conversations a lot, and she's like, you don't need all of that stuff in the church, right? All of the icons and the brass and the decorations that we have. Um, and I'm like, yeah, maybe we don't need it technically in the sense that it's not required, but it helps me feel closer to God. And to me, when the place where I'm worshiping is beautiful, where the worship itself is beautiful and reverent and holy, then it's easier for me to connect with what we're doing when we're there, which is worshiping God. And so that's the role that beauty plays for me and why I think it can be really important. I know that there's some people who are like, I'm fine in like, four wooden white walls, and I'm happy with that, right?
Yeah.
Um, and look, I think if you're happy there, then there are some very low church Anglican churches that are like that. I mean, that are more, frankly, more Methodist in their leaning, or more, I mean, there was one church in Houston that I went, I won't name which one it was, but my wife and I, we walked in and we were like, is this a Baptist church or is this an Episcopal church, right?
Mhm.
So there's a huge variety, is what I would say. Now, why I'm drawn particularly to the traditional, Anglo-Catholic worship is because of that beauty. And I think the importance of that for me is that when I see, and even outside of church, when I look outside, and I have the windows open right now over here, which is why I'm getting all this light. But when I look outside and I look at the beauty of creation, I also see God there, right? And so to me, it's like, if I'm not going to be outside amongst the trees and the flowers and the bushes and the grass and the flowers and all of the beauty of nature, or up on the mountains, or watching a river flow by, then I want to be in an environment that is as beautiful as God's creation, or at least tries to get close, right?
Sure.
Does
Some
that
of
make sense?
Yeah, some of what you're describing is just like aesthetic preferences. And all of that's fine, like you said, there's just a spectrum of what people choose to do and how they choose to create a building for their worship. Um, I agree with you in terms of the traditional Anglican worship style, that beauty, the you know yeah, a lot of people would argue that we don't need all that stuff, right? But part of going to church and having a sacred space is that it's holy, and holy just means that it's set aside, right? It's set apart for something
Hmm.
special. And all of those things help you to remember that this is a special place for a special purpose. And it's not it's the architecture, it's the liturgy, the music. That style of worship really shapes belief. And, for many people, the first encounter with Anglicanism isn't, um, it's not like argumentative in the sense that maybe some, Protestant evangelical churches are, kind of arguing their point. It's
Beating
walk,
someone over the head with a Bible,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
it's walking into a beautiful liturgy that's set aside um, for something very special. So I love that you put that as part of the vision statement. At first glance, using the word beauty sounds sort of strange and aesthetic, but really um, it is more spiritual. So I appreciate that so much. And you use the
Sure.
phrase, um, you use the
Well,
phrase,
hold on. One more thing about beauty before you move on to the next phrase.
yeah,
Um, one of the things I think is beautiful about the Anglican Communion is we have such space for variety in the way we worship. And
hmm,
so a lot of people don't know this, but like the Methodist movement started inside the Anglican Communion. And
hmm,
in fact, the Methodists in England stayed part of the Anglican Church. And so there are churches in, England, that are Anglican churches that are Methodist in the way that they approach
right.
worship, and the architecture and everything, the simplicity of the architecture. And that is part of the beautiful variety of the Anglican Communion, Big Tent. It's actually an interesting historical note about how the Methodists split off into a different church in the United States, which we can get into some other time.
Yeah, yeah, good point. That's part of the history that's so interesting. But the second part of the vision statement phrase is, you know, to renew the Episcopal Church by reintroducing people to the historic Orthodox and Catholic faith in its Anglican expression. Now, that's Catholic, little c Catholic. But those three words, historic, Orthodox, and Catholic, they carry a lot of meaning. And so, what do they signal to you? Um, why were they important words? You know, let's talk about historic.
Yeah, well, when I say historic Catholic Orthodox, what I'm referring to is um, taking, yeah, and it makes sense to take those a little bit one at a time. But what I'm talking about is that the Anglican Church is the continuation of for the English speaking world, right?
Yeah.
And so really, the English speaking world is started in England, but now has spread throughout the globe. And so really what you see in the history of the church in England is that it started, Christianity arrived shortly after the resurrection when Joseph of Arimathea brought Christianity to the shores of what we now call Glastonbury.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of local traditions in Glastonbury around the arrival of Joseph of Arimathea, but we don't need to get into all that now. We can, and again, in a future episode, if people are interested. Where should they email us again if they're interested in other topics?
Yeah. Episcopalian podcast, spelled out as one word, Episcopalian podcast at gmail.com.
Okay, great. Episcopalian podcast at gmail.com. So really from the very beginning, you have Christianity um, in England. You have bishops represented at the very earliest synods in France that had come from England to visit and this was in like the very early parts of the fourth century, once Christianity was no longer proscribed. In other words, once it was no longer illegal in the Roman Empire, they started having these synods. They had these big meetings where they kind of were trying to work out some of the theological differences. From the very earliest days, you have representatives from the English church there at those synods. Um, and what I would just say is also from the very beginning, you see the sort of tripartite leadership, bishop, priest, deacon, also represented in the English church. The first liturgies were actually Celtic liturgies, which were in the not in Latin, but in the old Celtic language of the British Isles. And it wasn't until the seventh century that you see basically this ironic scenario where you have Roman uh, bishop kind of sent as a missionary, St. Augustine, who was sent to different St. Augustine and the St. Augustine who wrote City of God, and the not the patristic father St. Augustine, but
Right.
basically the St. Augustine that kind of brought the Roman church and the Roman liturgy um, to England. And then there was a whole sort of battle that went on. I mean, not a physical battle, but sort of an argument and a debate over the course of the ensuing century about, are we going to stick to the Celtic liturgy and the Celtic way of doing things that we've used for the last 600 years, or are we going to adopt the Roman liturgy? And ultimately, the side that wanted to adopt the Roman liturgy won out, largely because there was a desire on behalf of the kings at the time to kind of be more closely affiliated with some of the more continental European powers that use that same Roman liturgy. So they wanted to be seen as being part of the same church and playing ball and that kind of thing. But
Right.
still, the King of England was seen as the head of the church until the um, lay investiture controversy, which was the famous debate or disagreement between Henry II, I want to say, and Thomas Becket, who was his buddy that he made the Archbishop of Canterbury, not realizing that that was going to be a big
Right.
mistake. Because then Thomas Becket basically was a big advocate for the power and authority of the church and ultimately appealed to Rome in that controversy, and then Rome stepped in, and then you see the English church basically submitting itself to Rome for a period of about 300 to 400 years. It's somewhere in that range. And then in the time of Henry VIII, in which he decided to, because of sort of succession issues, wanted to have a male heir, appeal to the Pope to say, hey, I'd like an annulment. The Pope said no, because of, again, political considerations. His wife at the time was the sister of the most powerful Holy Roman Emperor since Charlemagne. A lot of people don't know that, but it's the facts. So the Pope was kind of playing it smart. He was like, ah, who's this little English king, right? I can't, I can't piss off Charles V. And so then what you end up with is a scenario where Henry basically asked the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Thomas Cranmer, hey, would you just go ahead and give me the annulment anyway? Thomas Cranmer says, yes, I'll do it. And the Pope excommunicates both of them, and basically by doing that, the entire Church of England. And as a result, you have the involuntary schism. We as Anglicans didn't want to leave the communion with Rome. That was the choice of Rome, basically not willing to grant the annulment as requested, or to honor the annulment once it had been granted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And look, for people who don't understand why the grounds for the annulment were made, basically the grounds for the annulment were that this is a woman, the woman he married, Catherine of Aragon, had been married to his older brother who died. And according to canon law at the time, you weren't supposed to marry your brother's wife.
Mhm.
That was forbidden. Well, the Pope had given a special dispensation to allow that to happen, in the first place. And basically the argument was, well, the Pope really shouldn't have done that because it was against canon law, but the Pope made a special exception. So, but if he was going to make a special exception, why wouldn't he then also grant an annulment when the time came? Well, because he didn't want to piss off Charles V. So, it's a lot of politics that were involved in there, and people don't understand that. It really wasn't some big ecclesiastical disagreement. So the church under Henry VIII remained the same, Holy Catholic, Apostolic, Orthodox in theology. I'm saying small o Orthodox, which is to
Right.
say basically, um, the same faith carried over from the patristic fathers and the first seven ecumenical councils and
Yeah.
the three creeds, which a
Great.
lot of people know the Nicene Creed um, from the Council of Nicaea, but we also have the Apostles' Creed and the Creed of Saint Athanasius, which are all in the back of your Book of Common Prayer. If you don't have one, get one, because it's a good thing to have on hand at home. Yeah. But
Yeah.
yeah, does that answer why it's a very short, I've given you a short summary of the history of, and I didn't get into the more recent history. You do have ultimately under the Elizabethan era, you have a compromise that is really the founder of the modern Anglican Church is Elizabeth I, as basically the one who authored the Elizabethan Compromise, which was a compromise between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants of her time, basically saying, well, we're going to maintain this Catholic faith, but we're going to basically stay independent from Rome and ultimately have express our own sovereignty, just like we had for the first, 12 centuries of the church.
Right. So historic, in a nutshell, is being rooted in the early church. And Orthodox, you've described that in your initial discussion, what Orthodox means, and being faithful to the creeds. And so you hit on that. And then Catholic. Let's talk about Catholic, because that word gets confused a lot of time, because there's little c Catholic and there's big C Catholic. So um, Catholic, just with the little c, just simply means that we're connected to the universal church. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about in terms of what that word means to you or why you chose it for the vision statement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the well, first of all, one more thing I wanted to say about Orthodox for those who have not seen the Substack I put on there,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm actually trying to pull it up so I get the exact name right, but it's hard for me to find it because it's not showing up on Google yet. It's a pretty new Substack, so we created a Substack. Could you help remind me what the if I look under my subscriptions, I'll be able to find it that way. But my internet's a little
Yeah, I'll find
sluggish.
the title for the sub of your Substack article. It's
Yeah, tell me
but
that, and that way I can, people can we can link it in the show notes, and people can look at that if they're more interested
yeah,
about
absolutely.
why I see that being Anglican is being Orthodox in the English construction of what is Orthodoxy.
Yeah, the title of your Substack article, and it's a great article, by the way. It's Why I'm Anglican and Orthodox, because Anglicanism is English Orthodoxy. And
Right.
it's an excellent article and really goes into some of the history. And it's a really good attempt to spell out why this is an important concept. There's a concept now that's pretty popular. Well, I say pretty popular. We're not talking about like, massive popularity, but a lot of people are talking about this concept of inclusive orthodoxy inside of the Episcopal Church. And I think that's a great concept. But I think that part of what your article really helps to describe is some of that, what we might call inclusive orthodoxy. Um,
Yeah.
you do
What is the
excellent
what
work.
is the Orthodox part? Yeah, what is the Orthodox part of that inclusive work? So, and I'm a big fan of inclusive Orthodoxy, as you know. In fact, my next Substack, which I'm almost finished with, is looking at um, the inclusive side of that, which I want to talk a little bit about at the end of our
Yeah.
podcast today. But um, yeah, so I would encourage people to check out uh, that podcast, that Substack, Why I'm Anglican and Orthodox, because Anglicanism is English Orthodoxy.
Mhm.
And I, but yeah, getting into the Catholic side of that, which I think is um, Orthodox, which is it's really kind of, and I think this is reflected by the fact that we are as a communion, as Anglican communion, we are in communion with the old Catholic Church. So that for those who don't know what the old Catholic Church is, the old Catholic Church are bishops, priests, deacons who felt that the conclusions of Vatican I and Vatican II around overreach.
Mhm.
They believed, which is what we believe, which is what the patristic fathers believed and the early church believed and practiced, which is that synods, which is just sitting together in a community of coming to a consensus about the issue, is the only way that you're going to approach and truly infallible. But it's sort of the closest, and that really we shouldn't be using this term infallible anyway, because look, we're humans, right? um, and ultimately only God is infallible. So I think that by definition. So I would say that for me, really, if you love everything about the Catholic Church, but you feel that some of the excesses of the papacy, either historically, which I'm not going to get into a history lesson on that, but definitely check it out, or some of the more recent claims made by the papacy about infallibility are, um, excessive or not in alignment with historical Christianity, um, uh, then frankly, we may be the church for you, right? And I think also if you look at some of the things that were going on even back during the Reformation, um, then with around the selling of indulgences and that kind of thing, where basically the Pope was saying, here, come give me a donation for St. Peter's, and then I'll say, well, your sins are absolved and you're saved because you've paid me this money. That was one of the sort of hot button topics of the time, but it's also that's continuing. I don't know whether people realize plenary indulgences are still being sold by the Vatican. The other thing I would say, I mean, Council of Trent really dug in its heels. I mean, if you read about it, it's like we basically we're not doing anything wrong. We're doing everything the right way. There's nothing to reform. There's nothing to change. And so if you believe that the Roman Catholic Church of the Middle Ages is still correct, then you should, maybe be a Roman Catholic. But if you believe that any of that stuff was probably not the best way, then maybe consider becoming Episcopalian Anglican. And what I would just say, on another level, looking at the structure of the church, and I'm pointing out the differences for a reason, by the way. So I'll get to that in a minute. But if you look at the structure of the church, the Roman Catholic Church is very hierarchical, very top down. Bishops get assigned, priests get assigned. If you don't want to be there, too bad. You don't have a choice. It's like it's all very much a top down assignment of clergy and really of the whole structure and discipline of the church. Um, the way that the Anglican Communion has been constituted, certainly more recently, and certainly in the Episcopal Church, even more so, is really a reflection of our national polity in the United States. That's a democracy, right? Or a representative democracy. And so, our church is very much a ground up church. We have um, individual parishes elect vestries. The vestries send representatives to the diocesan convention. The diocesan convention elects the bishops. They also send representatives to the national convention. The national convention meets, and those representatives all get together and, along with the bishops, decide the future direction of the church. So it's a very grassroots, bottom up approach to understanding the way Christianity should operate while still maintaining that sacred apostolic succession of bishop, priest, deacon, and putting that primacy of saying, well, the House of Bishops does get a veto. If the people say one thing, but then all the House of Bishops get together and they all say, we're not sure about that, then guess what? We have to wait. We have to see. We have to give it some more time. So, and I think that that's really both honoring the will of the people and the consensus of the understanding of Christ and of God that emerges over time, but also that historical, traditional, apostolic authority that descends from the apostles through the bishops. Um, what else? So I think really those are the two main differences, just in terms of infallibility of the Pope and the special role. Look, and we are happy to acknowledge the sort of first among equals. Uh, primum inter pares is the Latin of the Bishop of Rome. That's not a problem. It's really more the idea that because of his status as the first among equals, he should therefore have sort of supernumerary powers of being able to say, well, things are infallible and everybody has to do what I say, where we kind of draw the line. And, that and the hierarchy, those are really the two differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a great article that came
Beyond
out.
that, you can find the same level. I mean, go ahead. I want to hear what you have to say.
Sorry, yeah, maybe you cut out a little bit there for a second. I'm not sure because I thought. But anyway, there's a great article in the Living Church that came out just last month. It's by, oh gosh, who wrote the article? Mark Flavier, and he talked about Anglican constitutionalism and how the Anglican Church was really formed by, and especially in the Episcopal Church, formed the Constitution and vice versa. And so that these two things are not, they they're not just separate, right? Like we have to understand that constitutionalism um, in the church is is a corporate aspect, right? That's helped stabilize us. So anyway, I love what you were bringing up there in terms of what what that means in terms of Catholic in the universal church. What do you think if someone's unfamiliar with the Episcopal Church or with Anglicanism? Why do you think that the tradition matters today? And, how is it relevant today? How would you answer that?
Yeah, well, actually, I had one more thing to say about the Catholicity of the church. Unfortunately, my connection was a little unstable, but I'm going to tie it into answering your question,
Okay,
okay?
great. Yeah.
Because it's very much tied together. So basically, I've been watching a lot of videos of Roman Catholics lately who have been attending ordinariate parishes, which are parishes that use the Anglican liturgy, and they're talking about how great it is and how much they love it and how much they like it so much more than the Novus Ordo because it's so much more reverent and it reminds them of the traditional Latin Mass. And it's like, well, yeah. And I don't know if you know this, but the traditional Latin Mass is getting like a huge surgence of interest and
Yeah.
support online right now. Um, and there's kind of like a little war going on internally within the Roman Catholic Church about how much are we going to allow the traditional Latin Mass to be done versus requiring everyone to do the Novus Ordo, which is
Yeah.
the new order of the Mass that came out of Vatican II, which totally restructured the flow of the Mass, uses modern contemporary language. It's most similar for Episcopalians as like a rite to, but like probably Eucharistic prayer. I want to say A or B.
Hmm.
It's much more contemporary than the traditional Anglican worship, which is more either rite to Eucharistic prayer D, which actually comes from, I believe it's the Alexandrian Mass, which is actually like an Orthodox Mass, or the Rite One Mass, of course, which is an English translation of the Latin Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass. Um, and that's my personal preference, and that's what they use in the ordinariate parishes predominantly. And so it's really funny to see all of these Roman Catholics go to see the Mass that we attend every week, and say, gee, I wish that we had this more readily available. This is the Mass we should be using. This is like as if the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo had a baby. And it's like, yeah, well, why do you think we love it? So it's funny to see that essentially there's this recognition, a deep soul recognition amongst Roman Catholics, even that the nature of our Mass a very holy, reverent, powerful experience that is deeply rooted in the tradition of the church as that English translation of the traditional Latin Mass, which it is. Um, and I think that really, when I think about the traditions of the church, that's where I think about the Catholicity of the church, of like pulling forward all the things that are great about Rome, all the things that worked about the one holy Catholic and apostolic faith, and that do work about it and continue to work about it, which are the things that have always been there. St. Vincent of Lerins always comes to mind. It's like the things that the church has always been doing at all times and in all places. And so, if you look at the order of the Mass and you look at the way that we have continued to bring that forward into the English language, I think it's by far the most beautiful expression of the Mass in the English language that I've ever experienced. And for those who are looking for a holy, reverent, um, but English language experience, that may be a little more inclusive of, say, women, for example, I would encourage them to come check it out.
Yeah. One thing that strikes me about Anglicanism and the Episcopal Church is that it doesn't try to reinvent Christianity every generation. It really stewards something that's been handed down, which is really important to me. The tradition piece is very important to me. The liturgy really, we consider the liturgy the most important aspect of Christian formation. I think young people today are looking for tradition. They're looking for people who are willing to stand up for something that they believe in. They're drawn to the sacramental worldview that we have in the Episcopal Church. There's a lot of intellectual humility inside of our tradition also, which is to say that we don't know everything, right? And so
Right.
that is, I think, why it is so relevant today. And so as we think about Anglican tradition historically, one of the things that fascinates me is how authority has been structured in the church. So, Anglicanism historically has had a very interesting balance between bishops, clergy, vestries, and the parish. And you touched on that just a
Mhm.
little bit in what you were just describing. So, can you describe now what that traditional balance looked like, maybe in the past, and maybe even how it's changed?
Yeah, so one of the core principles, and believe it or not, this actually comes from the Roman Catholic Church, although I would say it's probably the Roman Catholic Church has experienced a lot of the same phenomenon that I'm about to describe about the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion in general in the last couple hundred years, again, since Vatican I. I think it's interesting how we sort of all impact each other in a way. Um, But what we've seen is historically is that basically in each diocese, oh, the power's back on. That's great. In each diocese, the bishop is essentially historically is a king in his own diocese. Um, and what that means is that there's a lot of local control of how things are done. And then also you have the principle of subsidiarity, which is this idea that it's devolution of power. It's the idea that as much as possible be decided on the parish level. So one parish may like to do things one way, and then a parish, down the street likes to do something different, and that's totally okay, as long as they're both still staying within the bounds of the historic faith, right? Um, Local parish level, that can be decided on a diocesan level, and then only be left to the national church, right? And that historically has always been how the Episcopal Church has operated, the Anglican Communion in general has operated, and and then really only the things that absolutely must be resolved on the universal sort of international front get resolved on that level. But that's really very few things,
Yeah.
and it's really, I would say, the core elements of the faith, which I think we broadly agree upon from, again, this first seven ecumenical councils, the three creeds, the patristic fathers, um, the Orthodox faith, right?
Hold on to your thought for just a
Now,
second, because
uh,
you are cutting out just a
uh,
little bit. Hold on just a second.
so, historically, there has been this acknowledgement that we're going to have most of the power at the bottom, and then less power and less power and less power as we reach to the top.
Yep.
And that's, it's called subsidiarity, which as a principle means it's a devolution of power from the top to the bottom. It's like you try to devolve as much power as possible, as low as possible on the totem pole. So the
Right.
total, the power should look kind of like a pyramid, right? It's kind of how you think about it. Now, how has that changed? I think that what has happened in recent years, and I see it, I don't know exactly when it started in the Episcopal Church, but I see it, it's worse for sure in the Episcopal Church than it is, say, in the Church of England. Because in the Church of England, it's still pretty much each bishop is a king in his own diocese, his
Yeah.
or her own diocese. And so, that has actually prevented a lot of the schismatic elements of that we've experienced in this country there. They really haven't had as much of a problem with that as we've had. Not that we've had a huge problem with it, but it's been an issue for sure, and certainly in certain parts of the country more than others. But I would say that, I think that because the national church in particular has really codified a lot of canons and constitutions that is really make certain demands and requirements of bishops,
Yeah.
that certain bishops may find it more difficult to operate as bishops in the Episcopal Church versus in, say, the Church of England or other Anglican provinces, especially if they are outside of the middle 65% of thought on any particular topic, whether that be, women's ordination, LGBT inclusion, same-sex marriage, etc.
Right.
And so I think that in a way, that is the reason why that's problematic is because it can result in more schism.
Yes.
And so the reason why I'm in favor of subsidiarity as a phenomenon is, hey, if you have a really conservative part of the country, it's reasonable to think you might have a church that's more conservative in that part of the country, and that's fine. Let them be conservative. And if we have disagreements, let's get together and work them out. And if people disagree, then sometimes we just are going to have to agree to disagree for now and let time tell
Right.
us the answer. Right? Just like in the of Arius versus Athanasius, given
Mhm.
time, the church figured out that even though he was in this tiny minority at one point, where he was the only bishop supposedly who professed Orthodox theology, eventually he convinced the whole rest of the world that he was right. So
Yeah.
if you truly believe you're right, you have an obligation to stick around and, basically convince your peers that you are right. And the only time schism to me is justifiable is when it's involuntary. And I
Yes.
think that what's his name? Is it Redeemed Zoomer? That he's got a really great article or video on voluntary versus involuntary schism. And I think to me that is such an important distinction because, when you're basically kicked out of a church, then it's reasonable to say, okay, fine, I'll have to start my own church now, right? But if you're allowed to come and allowed to take communion and allowed to participate, professing the views that you profess, then you have an obligation to stick it out and disagree with and verbally and show up and continue to profess what you believe. And the bishops of ACNA, which are the bishops that schismed most recently from the Episcopal Church, over again, women's ordination, same-sex issues. Um, they were still allowed at the table. They were still invited to come to uh, the General Convention, the House of Bishops, and only when they basically said we're leaving, were they then inhibited, which is to say, prevented from practicing
Right.
from. Uh-oh, what happened?
Well, we had We are having a little bit of technical issues today, I think because of our weather here
Yeah,
locally, but
that's
we're
fine.
still going. So
Yeah.
we're
Okay,
talking
great.
about the bishops, most recently
Yeah,
schismed in the Episcopal Church, that they were, um, yeah, yeah, they
yeah,
were
that
inhibited.
basically they were still welcome up until the point they said we're leaving, at which point, okay, now we have to inhibit you so that we can protect the church. But
Absolutely.
it's like they didn't have to leave, right? If they just said we're not going to leave, we're staying, but this is what we believe. And
Yeah.
we're like Athanasius against the world, right? They would still have been welcome, and they are still, as far as I'm concerned, maybe not those particular bishops, but a lot of people who left and without being inhibited, they just left because they wanted to leave, are welcome to come back. And I think that there's certainly an opportunity for a negotiated settlement that would allow people to have considerable local control and to maintain a conservative voice. For me, as a traditional liberal, I feel that everybody's voice is not only to be tolerated, but actually necessary. And that was something I also learned from your dad, that ultimately, one of the big mistakes we make is thinking, well, we can have a church without any conservative voices or without any, somebody who's radical one way or radical the other way. And I think that that's a fallacy. The church has always been a unifying force that unifies people of different beliefs. The main thing, I didn't talk about this earlier, but I got to bring it up. I may have mentioned it in the other episode, but the main thing that had me feel most certain and most at home about being in the Episcopal Church was that it's the program for college students. When you're in college, you're at your school. There's usually, I mean, if it's a big enough school, there's a canterbury, and that's where college students who are Episcopalian get together and socialize and do things and worship together and have Bible studies and that kind of thing. It's basically like a church, but just for the students. And when I was at University of Texas, um, and I was part of the Canterbury there, I remember this very one night where we had a very contentious debate about, was Jesus a communist or a capitalist, right? And it was like we were at each other's throats, and the room was divided 50-50. I mean, it was a great night. And then afterwards, we all came back to the table. We all enjoyed some spaghetti and, meatballs or whatever with each other and continued the conversation. And then we all come back together on Sunday and worship together, right?
Right.
And it's like, this is to me a model of how humans have to interact. This is to me
Yeah.
the kingdom of God on earth, right?
Yeah.
It's like people who can agree and then who can disagree vehemently, like in their core fiber of their being. And yet, at the end of the day, agree to disagree and worship the same Lord who we all have, right?
Right.
And that to me is what it means to be Episcopalian at its fundamental level, is that willingness to have that big tent and accept people. And every time I see a Episcopal church and I see that all are welcome sign, uh, I smile, because it's true. The fact of the matter is that all are welcome. Now, does that mean we're going to change what we do to make you happy? Probably not. Maybe, but probably not, right? If you convince us, if you make a compelling enough argument, we'll consider it. We're open.
Yeah.
But it does mean that all are welcome to come and learn and grow in their relationship with Christ, in communion with us and in community with us,
Yeah.
and discover why we do what we do. That's what I would invite anybody who was coming and wants to try and learn about the Episcopal Church. Come do a newcomers class. Come do what some places is called a catechism class. What some places is called uh, and the why underneath the praxis. What it is we're going to see, if it makes sense to you and you want to continue to do that.
Yeah. Come and see. I love that.
What do you think, Ann? All right, we're back on Wi-Fi. We should be good to go now.
Awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
something that I think, I don't want to sound accusatory, but you mentioned the schism piece and the role that bishops played in that a little bit, and I really, frankly, feel like bishops have had way too much um, authority in the Episcopal Church to actually drive us through this schism that we've had recently. It's really unfortunate. And, I feel like the role of a bishop is just to be a shepherd to the shepherds, right? And not to not to exercise all this crazy personal animus that they have about any get one given issue. And so what do I think? I think that you are absolutely right that the canons in the Episcopal Church give so much authority. If you actually read the canons, they give so much authority to the parish and to local leadership, to the vestry. And, bishops really should be more sh- overseers in a shepherding sense rather than just administrators. Um, what do you think about apostolic oversight and the role of maybe the theological role of a bishop in the church in terms of apostolic oversight or unity or teaching?
Yeah, really two. One is this idea that bishops have authority, and one is what should a bishop really do? Some So you really asked two questions there. One
Yeah.
is about whether bishops have too much power, and the second one is about what is the true role of the bishop. And the first, I'm going to answer kind of both of them together. So the first part of the question, I would say, and bishops power from two directions, right? Bishops have power from God passed down through the session, but also have the power we give them, right? And so what do I mean by that? I mean, so I'm going to sound like a conservative here for a second, which is kind of ironic given our dynamic. But I'm in that I'm going to advocate for something called personal responsibility, which is something that conservatives like to talk about a lot. But I would just in those dioceses who represent the parishes, well, first of all, who are part of the parish, and electing the responding to propositions, what forward this proposal of like, hey, let's secede from the Episcopal Church, join the Southern Cone in Argentina or wherever the heck it is, right?
Mm, right.
And what was the last thing you heard?
Um, the ACNA group going down and joining the Southern Cone.
Right. So when Bishop Eicher first put that forward, it had to be approved twice by the diocesan convention, which is made up of, to some degree, the priests in the diocese, but also the laity that have been elected and that have come from their respective parishes to represent the people of the diocese. So, on one hand, is the bishop to blame for putting forward a schismatic proposition? Absolutely.
Right.
I would argue from the first time he did that, he could have been inhibited by the national church. On the other hand, are we the parishioners, we the people, to blame for following a schismatic bishop, off the edge of a cliff like lemmings? Absolutely, right? The fact of the matter is that if every single parishioner had said, no, we're going to stay part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, we're going to stay part of the traditional faith, we're going to honor our relationship to the Episcopal Church that our parents and grandparents and ancestors have had up through time immemorial, all the way back to England, then guess what? Bishop would not have gotten his way, and maybe he
Yeah.
would have left and started his own church or done some other thing, but the diocese would have stayed intact and would have stayed loyal, and the Episcopal Church would have sent a new diocese, a new bishop to replace that temporarily while we then elected a new bishop. And is it the bishop's fault? Yes, to some degree, but is it also the people's fault? I think just as much. And I think that we have to be careful when it comes, and Jesus warns us about this, following false prophets, following, leaders who are going to cry his name, but then when actually it comes to how they live their life and, the way that they're approaching the church, are not doing it in the way he told us to do. He makes it very clear that unity of his believers is of utmost concern, right? It is of foremost concern. And all of the early church fathers and, the apostles, the patristics, they all agreed unity first and foremost. In fact, they had a rule. The rule was, you go into a community, if there's already a church there, you don't plant a new church there. You go somewhere else, plant a church somewhere else, right? And that was like Redeemed Zoomer, again, I keep quoting him. He has a new video just where he's been talking about that. But this was like an unspoken, understood, rule that this is how you do things. And yet, what we've seen since the Protestant Reformation, and it's really interesting because people don't always understand that with the Protestant Reformation, what you had like whole national churches that got excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church that then said, okay, well, now we're going to have the Church of England or the Dutch Reformed Church. So it's not so much that that the bishops have too much power inherently, but it's more that the people give them too much power when they're willing to follow a schismatic bishop, right? When a bishop is trying to destroy the unity of the church, which is something that everyone from the patristics to the apostles all put at primacy. They said the unity is the most important thing. And we were talking about, I remember now, we were talking about the fact that there was this unwritten rule that you basically have one church per unit of land, essentially, per jurisdiction.
Right. The
And
jurisdiction.
you don't overlap on each other. And that just has totally collapsed in the last couple hundred years.
Yeah.
But I think that ultimately when you follow somebody who's headed out the door to go start their own denomination, you're moving in the direction of every man is his own church.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that you end up with every man is his own church at the end of that road, right? It's sort of like, and so these are the diametric opposed sort of concepts, right? Either you have an infallible pope where everything flows from him, right?
Yes.
And all truth flows from the pope on one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have every man is his own church. And, the truth is often in what Ford, what was his name? Henry Ford, I think is his name. No, not Henry Ford. Howard Ford. Anyway, whatever. He called the excluded middle, right? And the excluded middle is basically this, the middle 65% of reality that nobody wants to discuss because all the juice is on the extremes.
Exactly.
And the excluded middle is really what you find in the Episcopal Church, specifically in the Anglican communion more broadly, where we have this historic apostolic succession. We have bishops, priests, and deacons who can trace their lineage all the way back to the apostles. And we have this ground up democracy that is basically forms the other half of the leadership of our church. And so we have the best of both worlds. Now, when either of those two becomes too powerful, you run into problems. And I think that's what we saw with the schism is you had a schismatic bishop that basically people gave too much credit to and too much uh, obeisance to, and ultimately, followed out the door as he contravened the explicit instructions of the apostles and church fathers. Which brings me to answering your second question, which was, what about the tradition? And specifically, what is a bishop really supposed to do? What is the bishop's job historically? And the way I see it, and you can feel free to disagree because you have a different perspective on this, but the way I see it is fundamentally the bishop's job is actually to take care of his priests, right? To nurture their spiritual development, to make sure that they are on the straight and narrow. In other words, that they're not preaching something that's just totally wackadoo and totally, blasphemy or, because there has been cases of that, or just, like extreme heresy, which is to say heresy against one of the fundamental doctrines of the faith, right? So if basically you have a priest that's preaching, oh, the resurrection didn't happen, right? That's a priest that needs to be, disciplined. We'll put it mildly and say disciplined,
Yeah.
right? And so the bishop's job is to take care of his priests, nourish his priests, fundamentally, to deal with conflicts between priests and their vestries, or priests and their parishioners if there's something that comes up, or cases of abuse, that kind of thing.
Right.
But fundamentally, or conflict between clergy, right? That that's certainly the bishop's purview. But that's, and then obviously to serve as one of the members of the House of Bishops when it comes to deciding any kind of direction of the church moving forward. That's how I see the role of the bishop. But you tell me what you see that's the same or different from that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And like I said, sort of in the preamble to the question that I asked, is that I 100% that bishops over the last probably 50 years in the Episcopal Church have been given too much authority um, in the way they can operate and operate even outside, kind of extra canonically or outside of the Constitution and canons of the Episcopal Church by
Hmm.
having their own personal policies for their diocese. And and so we saw a lot of that during the big 2007, 2008 schism here in the Episcopal Church. Um, a lot of unfaithfulness. And then the poor, the poor, you're talking about the people who followed these bishops. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people just, they're not paying a lot of attention, you know?
See,
And
I think that's the big issue, actually, Anne. And I want to
yeah.
push back on one thing you said, which is I don't think it's necessarily because, again, historically, the bishop was a king in his own diocese, and that
Mhm.
has worked really well for thousands of years. The problem isn't that the bishop has too much power. The problem is that he's two things that I see. Number one, people have become too sort of dependent on the idea that the bishop is always going to do the right thing or have their best interest at heart, which obviously sometimes is not the case. And so
Right.
that's why we have a national church to discipline those bishops. So to me, as a faithful Episcopalian, the moment that Bishop of Fort Worth, Jack Iker, was inhibited, okay, he's no longer my bishop. Who's the new bishop? Okay, we have an acting person, and then we're gonna, and to me, that just is like, if you're paying attention, that's how you think about it. And
Yeah.
that's what I think you said, is that a lot of people were not paying attention. And I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. And then the fact of the matter is, there are some people who were paying attention, but just frankly agreed politically or, on women's ordination or LGBT issues with Jack Iker. And they said, well, we're going to follow him because I agree with him. without thinking about the long-term ramifications of like, wait, what am I doing here? I'm leaving the church that I've been in my whole life, or that is the church of my ancestors. And is this really what we should be doing? Or should we be, staying in and fighting it out if we truly believe that this is the truth,
Yeah.
right?
I think we need to absolutely address that in an upcoming episode, maybe just that topic alone, because this idea of having a Venn diagram where you have your political ideology and then Christianity, and where do those intersect? Um, and this, idea that a political ideology in the culture should be something that causes schism or a lack of unity in the church. So
Yeah.
I think we need
Yeah.
to
More on
dive
that for
into that
sure.
more.
Yeah.
But I don't think you were quite finished with your thought. I'm sorry. I think I talked over you a little bit.
No, no, you're fine. I mean, I was just thinking about the fact that essentially the bishop it's not so much, as I see it anyway, that the bishop is too powerful. It's that two things are going on. The first thing is what I described just a minute ago, which is that, people aren't paying attention. And while you do have some bishops who are going off the range, and they're not putting, and I think what happened with that schism is it became about loyalty to the Episcopal Church versus loyalty to our bishop. And
Hmm.
that's not even the conversation. The conversation is it should be about unity or schism, right? And
Yes.
that's the fundamental question. And as Christians, the answer to that question is always unity.
Yeah.
It's an easy answer, right?
Right.
So that's the first part. And the second part I see with regard to the episcopacy and how it is playing out in modern days, I think you're getting too much of bishops focusing on things that they really don't need to be focused on, right?
Yes.
So I think that on one hand, you have people not paying enough attention to when bishops go off the range. And I think bishops kind of over trying to micromanage and get involved. And we can have probably a whole other podcast
Yes,
talking
we
about this
could.
topic. But I think it's like bishops trying to like overly micromanage what's going on in their parish and overly filter out what the parish's desire is for their rector and
Mhm.
overly try to kind of shift. And I think this is kind of one of the most under-recognized issues right now in the church that we could probably devote a whole episode to.
Yeah.
But it's basically this idea that the episcopacy is thinks that in some bishops believe that they're there to kind of reform the church and move it in a particular direction, and they have a particular agenda for that direction,
Yes.
not just in terms of like growth or expansion or we want to spread the word of Jesus, but more like a particular political agenda. And therefore I'm going to filter out candidates that I think, if a parish puts up candidates for rector that I think maybe are not aligned with me enough on some of these political issues, I'm not going to even let them be heard of. And they have this office, and you're going to have to tell me the name of it, but it's like the office that evaluates candidates for rectors.
Hmm.
What's the name of that one? Diocesan
It's the transition office. I'm not
Transition
exactly sure.
Office. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So
something.
this
There's a
this
canon for
transition,
transitions.
the canons for transitions. And so the bishop basically appoints this person as like, hey, we want people that are sort of agree with us on things, rather than it should just be that the rector search, for example, is like the vestry basically gets to contact whoever they want. That it doesn't have to go through this intermediate filter of like going through this diocesan office of transitions, which then can discreetly reach out to people to see if they're interested. And then maybe they're going to say that they reached out to people, but they didn't but we don't know because there's no transparency about any of it. So
Right.
there's the lack of transparency, I think, is an issue. And I think that um, and that it can kind of look like Episcopal overreach, but it's hard to say, is it truly Episcopal overreach, or is it just a lack of transparency and maybe everything they're doing is on the up and up, but we just don't know. And
Hmm.
I think that there's this desire to keep things secret so that we don't step on anyone's toes. But I say, hey, come step on my toes. Like, I don't care. Let's let it all hang out, because that's the only way, again, we're going to get at the truth. And the truth is what I care about fundamentally,
Yeah.
And I mean, because that's Jesus, and that's why
Yeah.
we're here.
Yeah. I mean, you opened up a whole maybe 3 or 4 different podcasts worth of topics that we could dive into right there.
Okay, great.
I'll say that, um, you know, obviously we've had a minority of people leave the Episcopal Church and because of political disagreement. And a lot of people inside the Episcopal Church still are discouraged about the direction of the Episcopal Church right now. Um,
Well, yeah,
you
a
know,
lot of the people that, of your mindset who are more conservative, look, it's 40% of the church right now. It used to be 50% of the church, but then we lost 10%, right? So we lost the most conservative 10%. It used to be 50-50. Now it's 60-40, but still, we still have in the Episcopal Church way more conservatives. I mean, something like 4 to 5 times as many conservatives, at least, as ACNA has in their total population.
right.
So how much sense did it make for them to leave? Like, anyway.
Yeah. One word that you used kind of to wrap all this up, because
Sure.
I don't want to end this in kind of in a on a discouraging note. So one of the things that you talked about in the mission statement that you wrote was this term renewal.
Mhm.
What does that mean to renew the Episcopal Church? And how does that, because that's going to have to start at the local level, um, in faithful communities who
Right.
honor their traditions, right? So, what does that look like to you? What would you say to those folks?
Yeah, I mean, to me, and this is again probably a whole series of podcasts about Episcopal renewal and what that looks like. To me, as somebody from the inclusive Orthodox camp, I would say that renewal looks like a return to orthodoxy and orthopraxy, while we still maintain that thing that is beautiful and unique about us as Episcopal Orthodox Anglican Christians, which is that we have female priests, that we have full inclusion of LGBT in the life of the church, that
Mhm.
we have, uh, recognition of same-sex unions and same-sex marriages. To me, that is it truly makes us distinct. If you look for any other church that is Catholic or Orthodox, that shares those inclusive values, you're not going to find it. Okay, it doesn't exist. Okay, and so we have a very unique combination, and I think that's worth preserving. But I think the important part about preserving that, as I see it, is a return to the the Orthodox faith as it was handed down from the apostles of Christ crucified and resurrected, for us and for our salvation, that has been handed down through the last, 2 millennia. And I think we need to get back to that. And we're not going to have time today to talk about it, but just to give you a quick 30-second, I went to do an interesting dive because I wanted to see like what people always talk about theological liberalism and theological conservatism.
Mhm.
And to me, I was really interested in like, could you make a conservative, theologically conservative, like honoring the authority of scripture argument for being inclusive in the church, Um, and I think I have a pretty good one. But what I'm going to say is that it actually led me into a whole rabbit hole, which we'll get into in our next episode, about what is the authority of Scripture, and like what is that, like what is the role of Scripture in our faith as Episcopalian Anglicans, and how is it different from other denominations, either and how is it different from scholars who just read the Bible like as if it's a history book, right? So,
Right.
and really, how does scriptural, the authority of Scripture, how does that impact our faith and the practice of our faith and the direction that we're going to head as a church in the years and decades and centuries to come? Because I think it's an important question that we've sort of still haven't resolved as a community. And maybe we don't need to fully resolve it, but I think we need to come to a greater understanding of how the apostles viewed it, how the patristic fathers viewed it, how the early church viewed it. And I think that can help inform our view of Scripture. And I think if we can kind of go back to their view of Scripture, um, and still hold on to all of the beautiful, what did Cardinal Henry Newman call it? Evolution that the church has gone through in the ensuing centuries, and not say, well, if it's anything that's happened since, you know, the fourth century, we're going to throw it out. No, but not throw out anything from that time either, right? It's like we'll take that as the strong foundation and build on it, and things that build on it. You know, one of the things I love reading is books by priests and bishops and monks. And I mean, to me, those are some of the greatest modern witness of God. You know, I think about God, I love to use the mug analogy, right? It's like if you're looking at God from like this one particular angle, you're going to see mostly handle. But then if you look at God from over here, there's no handle and not really anything on it. You look over here, you see this graphic here. So it's like, well, hold on. I mean, there's all these different ways that we can look at God and discover God, and that has to be an ongoing process.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to leave room for that, but also understand authority of Scripture. So that's a whole nother conversation, which I'm desperate to have, but we'll have to save it for another episode because I know you're out of time.
Ryan, thank you so much for the conversation. I'm really looking forward to continuing these
Thank you, Anne.
discussions. And thanks to everyone listening. We hope these conversations help people rediscover the beauty and depth of the Anglican tradition.
Amen.